All right, hello and welcome to our next session, which is titled Changing Political Landscape. And in this session, we're going to try and set the scene for our political explorations for the rest of the conference. My name is Catherine Pendry. I'm a general practitioner and epidemiology scholar and member of the organising committee. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Judith Brett. Judith Brett is a historian of Australian politics and public policy. She has now retired from her position as Professor of Politics from La Trobe University, but she's still kindly joined us. Her writings, particularly about the Liberal Party, have been widely influential, and she's published several acclaimed works, including on Robert Menzies and John Howard, among others. She's written several quarterly essays on For Black Ink, including the coal curse, resources, climate, and Australia's future, and has been a vehement critic of the Coalition's failure to take climate change seriously. Please welcome now Professor Judith Brett.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Now, where's my little clicker? Not that sorry. Okay, now the task that I was given, was asked to do, was to sketch some of the political background or the political landscape of where we've been over the last wasted decade and where we are now. So it's a political scene-setting task, and I'll do that, if you like, I'm going to do that in two parts. I'm going to mostly spend my time giving an overview of the sorry tale of the more than 2 decades of climate change denial that we've had in Australia and the wasted opportunity, not just to congratulate ourselves as thinking that we're in a better place now, but also because some of the forces that led to that are in fact still in place. And then I'll finish off by looking a little bit at the situation we're in now. So, to begin with the overview, which essentially I described as much as I could in this quarterly essay, The Coal Curse, which was published in 2020. And I began writing it when the fires were burning across southeastern Victoria. And the question that I was trying to answer was, how did climate change denialism get such a strong grip on the Australian political class? And the answer that I developed was twofold. It's a story about economics, but also about politics. It's about the economic reality of Australia as an exporter of fossil fuels and the politics that flowed from that as the fossil fuel lobby infiltrated the coalition parties in particular, but was also able to exert influence inside the Labor Party. This lobby may have had a setback with the change of government, but it hasn't gone away. Now, the story begins with economics. For most of the 19th century, well into the 20th, in fact, until the 1950s, Australia rode on the sheep's back. Wool was our largest export earner, followed by agricultural products such as grains, fruit and dairy. I have to say my... Oh, it's there. Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. And our largest market was Britain. By the, excuse me, by the early 1960s, the picture had changed almost entirely. Wool had declined significantly, outcompeted by artificial fibres. But luckily for Australia's prosperity, the world was hungry for minerals, which we had in abundance, especially iron ore, which quickly became our largest earner of export income. And our major markets shifted from Britain to the industrialising countries of Asia, especially Japan, and then, as we all know later, at the beginning of the 21st century, to China. But one thing remained the same. Basically, the structure of our export industry stayed the same. We were still exporting raw materials. We weren't exporting capital-intensive manufactured goods such as cars, machinery and white goods. We were, at that stage in the 1960s, making those here, but they were being made for the domestic market behind protective tariff walls. They weren't for export, and so they weren't, in fact, internationally competitive. Now, during the 1990s, coal joined iron ore as an export staple, driven largely by further industrialisation of Asia and particularly China. Now, as the world price of coal rose, miners turned their attention to coalfields such as the Galilee Basin, which had previously been uneconomic to mine. They were too far from the seaports. But as the price rose, the economics shifted, and areas like the Galilee Basin, where the Adani mine is situated, came into play. In the early 2000s, liquefied natural gas joined iron ore and coal as our top earners of export incomes. This was first developed by Woodside in the northwest of Western Australia, and in 2015, liquefaction and export facilities were developed on the other edge of the continent in Gladstone in Queensland, and we're now the world's largest exporter of LNG. There we are. So that's just I don't do quite such fancy PowerPoints as Brett. That's very, but to just see, these are our top minerals and fuel exports for 2018 and 19, and you can see that notice that about 50% of our export income in that period is earned from fossil fuel exports. And that's the sort of economic reality, if you like, that we're up against. The picture's much the same today, in fact, even more so because the war in the Ukraine has boosted world demand and the price for Australia's coal and gas has gone up. So that's the economics, and it's the basis of the power the fossil fuel lobby's been able to exercise over our political elites. So I want to now say something about the politics, because it's the way in which the fossil fuel lobby has exercised that power that I think is the reason for the sort of sorry state we're in and that we need to understand. In the late 1960s, as iron ore mining expanded, the Australian Mining Industry Council was formed. Now, its initial aim was to be a fairly conventional pressure group that dealt with industry matters, exchange rates, export licences, foreign investment rule, that sort of thing. But in the late 1960s, mining was starting to face some new challenges. Firstly, from claims for Indigenous land rights, and secondly, from concern about the environmental impact of mining. Mining doesn't employ very many people, and we'll come to that a bit later. And miners concluded that they needed to convince the public at large that mining was crucial to Australia's prosperity. So what AMIC did was it developed campaigns that were directed at mass audiences to supplement their lobbying activities. The aim of its first mass advertising campaign was to head off the veto over mining that was being included in some of the land rights that were granted to Indigenous communities under federal and state legislation. This was pre-Mabo and native title legislation, but these were legislated land rights. The miners were seriously alarmed when the Labor government that was elected in 1983 with Hawke as Prime Minister, it took a proposal for uniform land rights to that election. That is, land rights that would be the same across all of the state jurisdictions. And this proposal included that there would be a veto, that native rights holders would have a veto over mining exploration and mining activities. This was seriously alarming. It was a right that the rest of the population who had freehold titles didn't have. If you've got a freehold title, a miner can still come in and explore on your land. This campaign was spectacularly successful. The core message that they organised it around was that native title holders or land rights holders shouldn't have any rights that was different or superior to the ones that ordinary Australians who own freehold title had, or non-Indigenous Australians. So the campaign, as I said, was spectacularly successful, and Labor dropped the plan to legislate uniform land rights. Now, for the politics of climate change, which is what we're interested in, this success had two results. It greatly increased the confidence and the capacity of the mining lobby to mount public campaigns to defend its interests. And it built strong links between the mining lobby, coalition politicians and the Murdoch press, creating a network of right-wing warriors who were primed to defend Australia's existing distribution of power and resources. The coalition, especially the National Party, was much less enthusiastic about Indigenous rights than Labor was, and the mining industry's campaign slogan about no special land rights chimed with the coalition's scepticism about policies based on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' status and suffering as invaded and colonised Aboriginal inhabitants and their descendants. John Howard, for example, argued that you can't have against a treaty by saying a nation can't have a treaty with itself. And he downplayed the mounting evidence of the massacres of Aboriginal people to focus on the achievements of material progress and settlement. Now, these were the culture wars. And here is John Howard with Hugh Morgan. Hugh Morgan is was at this stage the chairman of Western Mining, and he was a key figure in fostering links between the coalition government and the mining industry. He was an outspoken opponent of Aboriginal rights, and in 1996, when the coalition defeated Labor, the networks that he cultivated increased in their power. The climate culture wars around Indigenous rights just merged seamlessly into the climate wars. When climate change emerged as a serious political issue, the fossil fuel lobby already had strong links with the coalition and the Murdoch press, and the culture wars, as I said, morphed seamlessly into the climate wars. The fossil fuel lobby was especially concerned to stop the government from signing international agreements which committed Australia to reducing carbon emissions. The aim was to align the interests of the miners with the national interest in the mind of the public and the government by arguing that Australia owed its prosperity to mining and that any policies that reduced carbon emissions would damage the whole economy. So after Howard led the coalition to victory in 1996, the fossil fuel lobby basically had an inside running. There were some coalition politicians who were committed to combating global warming, such as Robert Hill, but they were sidelined and Australia negotiated a special deal for itself at Kyoto. During the 11 years of the Howard government, fossil fuel lobbyists built close relationships with relevant bureaucrats and ministerial advisors, gaining access to confidential reports and on occasion even writing cabinet submissions. I mean, it's a really shocking story. Now, an industry advancing its interests through lobbying, public advocacy, political donations and such like is par for the course, perfectly legal, and to be expected in a pluralist society where governments have to take account of a range of stakeholders. But this was something else. It was what gets called state capture, where the fossil fuel lobby was in fact able to shape government policy to its own advantage, and competing voices and interests were excluded. If it had been a sort of a standard run-of-the-mill pluralist discussion, then climate scientists and environmentalists and health experts would have also been at the table to discuss the policy, but they weren't. Instead, the government adopted a position towards the climate science, which was sceptical at best and denialist at its extreme, and climate scepticism and denial spread through the Australian right. Now, 2007, Kevin Rudd defeated Howard, in part because of the strong stance he took on climate change. I don't propose to sketch in the fate of Labor's failed emissions trading scheme and its re-emergence as a price on carbon after Julia Gillard replaced Rudd. But for 2 years, I think it's worth noting, for 2 years, from July 2012 until Tony Abbott ditched the misnamed carbon tax, Australia had an efficient, market-based set of emissions reduction policies. Emissions were starting to come down And Ross Garno, who Anna says will be speaking later to you, believes that had they been left in place, we'd be well on the way to achieving net zero by 2050 without the major disruptions we're now facing. Abbott won the 2013 election, as we know, in large part because he promised to abolish the price on carbon, which, as I said, he'd misleadingly called a tax. And here is I think it's a shocking photo. It's a picture of the jubilant members of the opposition on the day it was repealed in Parliament. And it's a picture which I'm sure is already a source of shame for some of them, particularly Kelly O'Dwyer, who has young children. Under Abbott's relentless oppositionalism, scepticism about global warming became an identity issue for the coalition and the Australian right more generally. And this spread to attacks on climate scientists and then to science itself. And proof of just how strong a grip the fossil fuel lobby had on the coalition is the sorry fate of Malcolm Turnbull and his unsuccessful attempts to steer the coalition government back to some sort of evidence-based climate policy. He made 2 attempts to legislate a framework for the energy market, which would encourage new investment, and the result was that he was ousted as Prime Minister by Scott Morrison. Now, at the 2019 election, we saw a shift in the fossil fuel lobby's strategy. It had built links with Labor as well as with the coalition politicians. It hadn't been able to capture Labor to the same extent, but it had powerful advocates within the Labor Party through the CFMEU and through Labor members who had seats in areas where coal mining was an important industry, such as Joel Fitzgibbon in the Hunter Valley. So at the 2019 election, you might remember, we heard a lot about jobs and the communities that were threatened by policies to wind back coal mining. So there was a bit of a shift of strategy away from talking about the whole national interest to the focus on the poor coal miners who were going to lose their jobs and the communities that they lived in. Now, like other mining, coal mining is not in fact a large employer. It currently employs around 50,000 people directly, and during the COVID, about 40,000 people across the universities lost their jobs, and there was not a peak raised at many of the higher levels of the elites. So there was a real it was as if somehow these coal mining jobs by these guys in hard hats were the most important jobs in the country, and were sort of holding us all up. The reason that they were able to get such power is because these jobs are geographically concentrated in particular electorates. And the National Party, which has a lot of threats to its political future because of the decline in the agricultural workforce, has stepped up as the champion of coal miners and of the resources industry more generally to become the party of coal as much as it's the party of agriculture anymore. And Labor's worked hard to reassure voters in electorates like the Hunter that it will look after their interests. Now, where are we now after the election in May? Well, the coalition was decisively defeated, as we know, by a combination of a swing to Labor and the Greens and the election of 6 Teal independents in previously safe coalition seats, who joined the 2 independents, also strongly committed to climate action, Zali Steggall and Helen Haines, who are already in the parliament. Labor took to the election a commitment to legislate a 43% reduction in Australian fossil fuel emissions by 2050. On 2005 levels by 2030, and this has now been passed with some amendments. It's to be a floor, not a ceiling. And as Prime Minister, Morrison did get the coalition to commit to reaching net zero by 2050, but it was a commitment without a plan. If you remember, he held up that plan, but if you looked at the plan, it was just some motherhood statement dot points. There was actually no real policies in place as to how this would be reached. Nor did the policies that the coalition took to the 2020 election include one on emissions reduction. My reading of the current situation is that the coalition has dealt itself out of the game and is irrelevant. And here are some of their leading lights, not quite knowing where to look on the day that Labor's legislation passed in the lower house. because that's a photo from the monthly. The Greens and the Teal Independents and the Independent Senator David Pocock all want faster action, and the Greens are pushing for the government to ban new gas and coal projects. The government, though, is refusing, and just last week it released permits for the companies to explore for gas and petroleum in an expanded area of Australia's oceans. So although we're seeing front of house real commitment, there's also, particularly in the sort of resources-linked portfolios, as evidence of the extent to which Labor is still enthralled to fossil fuels. The Resource Minister, Madeleine King, said that at the same time as we strive to reduce emissions, it must be emphasised that continued exploration for oil and gas in Commonwealth waters is central to alleviating future domestic shortfalls, gas shortfalls. The argument has now shifted away not so much on jobs but on energy affordability and security, which is very much how the Nationals argue it. So here we are again, with fossil fuels being aligned with the public interest. In this case, as I said, energy security and affordability for households and for businesses. There's an assumption here of business as usual while the country manages the massive transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy and a low carbon future. This assumption that we can sort of continue with business as usual while we make the transition is, I think, one of the three big barriers to achieving a safe carbon neutral future. After half a century or more of easy consumerism, many people in affluent Western countries like Australia are unprepared for the temporary sacrifices for long-term gains. And we need to add to this point that since the 1980s in particular and the grip that neoliberalism got on public policy, there's been increased inequality, which has meant that we've now got more people with little sacrifice in the country than we had in the 1980s, which makes it, I think, harder for introducing policies where there are going to be losers as well as winners. So that's the first barrier. The second one is that the big question is what is going to replace fossil fuels in Australia's export earnings? Now, Ross Garnaut, who I think is going to be talking about this later, has made a compelling case that Australia can become a renewable energy superpower, exporting renewable energy to the region. This is persuasive and it's optimistic, and there's some investment happening in this space, but it's a long way from achieving the scale necessary to replace coal and LNG in our export earnings. And the third barrier is the continuing existence of the vested interests, not just in the fossil fuel lobby, but in all the other areas of the economy which depend on fossil fuels, and are going to need to change the way they do things. So, for example, the car industry has started to lobby against legislated changes to fuel efficiency standards that would encourage the uptake of electric cars. That fossil fuels, if you like, are embedded in pretty well everything we do, in transport, in health, in construction, and the scale of the changes necessary, I think, can't be underestimated. So in a way, that's the last barrier I think that we're facing. It's implied in the three previous points. It's the scale of the changes required. We have to turn around a huge and complicated ocean liner, and there's going to be losers as well as winners, and a multitude of innovations to be needed. I think to end on an optimistic note, is that at least since the election we've made a start. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Professor Brett. I think everyone will agree that that was a pretty stark but incredibly useful portrayal of Australian politics over the last several decades, and puts us in a fantastic position from which to go forth and start thinking about solutions, acting as a collective group. I'm going to remind everyone that for the rest of the conference we're going to be trying to use the Menti app, the Mentimeter. So the details are up on the screen here. in terms of how to find out and log in. You can log your questions, and by clicking the thumbs up, you can vote for other people's questions, and the questions with the most votes will go to the top. We have just a couple of minutes, so yeah, if you all start furiously typing. We have just a couple of minutes for questions for Professor Brett. So I'll start with one, and then we'll try and get one from Mentimeter whilst you're all furiously typing. So the first question that I'd like to ask is, you've given us a fantastic outline of where we've come from. I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on how you think things might play out over the next few years, particularly with regards to the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and our politicians.
Well, one of the things that's happening with the fossil fuel industry is that capital is moving away from it. This is not so much happening like within the Australian system, but internationally, people are not investors are not wanting to put their money into new coal mines and new fossil fuel facilities because of the risk that they'll be stranded assets. That's happening much faster, I think, than anybody anticipated, particularly as the price of renewable energy has come down. So I feel moderately optimistic about the way in which the energy sector will be able to be transformed. And I think, like the car industry, it's interesting when I was reading about, like Australia on fuel emissions really lags the rest of the world. And I think that what we're seeing with something like the car industry is that they're trying what they've been doing for the last 20 years or so, if you like. And that as the public mood and conversation has shifted, that they'll become increasingly sidelined. So that's and there is capital moving towards investment in the sorts of renewable energy investment that Ross Garnaut has talked about and will talk to you more about. And I think Labor will starting to put in place policies to encourage that. But it's still walking both sides of the street. And I can't, although it is talking more about the need for jobs transition in the old coal mining communities by putting renewable energy infrastructure into those to provide new jobs. The big sticking point I see really is what we're going to export. Ross Garnaut will argue that we can export renewable energy, and that's probably true, but it's going to take a while.
Okay, fantastic. So we've got quite a lot of action on Mentimeter. Thank you everybody for getting on board with that. There's a lot of votes, I'm sorry it's not live streamed over there, but there's a lot of votes for questions about sacrifices, and it looks like it's coming through around a couple of things. One is individual sacrifices, how we can move from being in an individual consumerist type of mindset as individuals in a community. And I guess picking up on what you just said about exports, the sacrifices that we need to make as Australia, so perhaps thinking from the perspective of what you just touched on with the shift in economics from some communities which have profited in the fossil fuel paradigm to that, the disruption moving to a renewable sector. So I guess everyone's keen to hear perhaps how bumpy you think the transition will be that you just outlined in moving from fossil fuels to a renewable economy.
Well, I think it will be quite bumpy. Look, it depends. At the moment in Australia, the coalition, I think, have playing the politics very badly of being an opposition. The fact that they dealt themselves out of the Jobs Summit, I think, was a huge political error on their part. They risk becoming irrelevant in the short term. But there will be electorates where it will be possible for campaigns to be mounted about the need for us to keep mining coal or whatever. But in terms of individual sacrifices, I think this is quite a big issue. Like, for example, really, I think flying in planes, international travel for Australians, going on cruises, a lot of the sort of recreational activities which older people with disposable income spend their money on, are not really conducive to a carbon-free future until, you know, aviation gets itself fixed up. So I just don't see there being much appetite as yet in the population at large for a grasp of the fact that perhaps we need to start consuming less. It's not just about changing the energy source, but maybe there needs to be, you know, less consumption. Now, that's a thing that can be contested. Some people argue that that's a sort of an politically unrealistic goal to have in Western societies. And I'm probably a bit of a, you know, old Protestant in my upbringing, so I think, you know, can't understand why people get coffee delivered to their door and why people don't go and pick up their own takeaway, and, you know, so I'm a bit out of touch with the way a lot of modern people live, younger people live. But it seems to me that if we don't, if there's not some sort of general reduction in consumption, it's going to hit people anyway, but it's going to hit people in this sort of random way. So the people in the northern areas of New South Wales around Lismore and things that have been flooded, I mean, their capacity to enjoy an affluent, comfortable lifestyle has been decimated. What the floods in Pakistan were truly shocking when the SBS News shows them. So the consumption will be being reduced anyway because of the impact of various of the climate disasters, but it will be happening in this sort of random way.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Brett. If everyone can join me in giving a